Spain's shadow guarantees. They were never announced, never voted on, and never written into law. Yet when pressure arrived, markets behaved as if they existed. In Spain, confidence did not rest on promises made aloud. It rested on promises everyone assumed would be kept. To understand why shadow guarantees mattered, we need to return to a system shaped by memory. Spain had lived through visible rescues, public bailouts, and explicit state support. Those episodes left scars, political, social, and financial. When recovery began, officials were determined never to repeat them. Guarantees would not be declared. Support would not be promised. And yet, expectations lingered. The story begins with regional banks and strategic sectors still closely tied to the state. Balance sheets improved. Capital strengthened. Official links were loosened. On paper, institutions stood independently. But markets are shaped by history as much as structure. Investors remember what had happened before and price in what they believe would happen again. Early signs appeared during routine stress. Funding costs remained unusually stable. Risk premiums failed to widen as models predicted. Certain institutions borrowed more cheaply than peers with similar fundamentals. Nothing illegal explained it. Nothing official confirmed it. The difference was belief. Inside banks, that belief influenced behavior. Access to funding felt secure even without explicit backing. Risk tolerance edged upward. Long-term commitments were made under the assumption that extreme outcomes would be managed somehow. No one said the state would step in. No one needed to. Regulators observed the pattern with mixed reaction. On one hand, stability had returned without formal guarantees. On the other, market discipline was dulled by expectation rather than assurance. The system was calm, but its calm rested on an idea that had never been tested openly. What made shadow guarantees dangerous was their ambiguity. They reduced fear without defining limits. In a crisis, clarity matters more than comfort. Markets can price a rule. They struggle to price an assumption. Spain's system had gained trust without stating terms. That trust lowered costs, supported recovery, and encouraged growth. It also planted a question beneath the surface. What happens when markets discover where the shadow ends? Because guarantees that exist only in expectation can stabilize a system until the moment someone asks whether they're real. The expectations grew stronger precisely because they were never challenged. Each period of mild stress reinforced the belief that support, if needed, would arrive quietly. Funding rolled smoothly. Spreads remained contained. Investors treated certain balance sheets as implicitly protected, even as official statements denied any special status. Inside institutions, this translated into subtle shifts. Liquidity buffers were maintained, but with less urgency. Long-dated funding felt safer. Strategic plans assumed continuity through downturns rather than disruption. Risk was still managed, but its tail was discounted by assumption rather than evidence. What made the situation fragile was the absence of boundaries. Explicit guarantees defined scope and cost. Shadow guarantees defined neither. Markets could not know where support would stop, only that they believed it would not fail entirely. That belief encouraged concentration rather than diversification. Regulators faced a dilemma. Publicly denying expectations risked triggering doubt. Confirming them would formalize obligations they were unwilling to assume. Silence became policy, and silence in markets is often interpreted as consent. The distortion appeared gradually. Institutions perceived as closer to the state enjoyed advantages unrelated to performance. Capital flowed unevenly. Market discipline weakened not through subsidy, but through belief. The system remained stable, yet mispriced. External observers began to question the calm. Models failed to explain resilience during stress. Risk premiums no longer reflected fundamentals alone. Something unspoken was shaping behavior. Confidence had detached from structure. The danger was not imminent failure. It was misalignment. When expectations diverge from policy, eventual correction becomes more abrupt. Shadow guarantees cushion systems early, but they sharpen adjustment later. Spain's financial calm was genuine, but it was conditional. It depended on an assumption no one had tested publicly. And as conditions shifted, the cost of that assumption began to rise. Because when markets rely on promises never made, clarity eventually arrives by force rather than design. The moment of tension arrived when conditions shifted just enough to demand clarity. A regional shock tightened funding across Europe. Risk appetite thinned. Investors began reassessing assumptions they had never written down. For the first time, Spain's shadow guarantees were tested not by crisis, but by doubt. Funding costs moved unevenly. Some institutions saw spreads widen sharply. Others barely moved. The divergence exposed how deeply belief, not balance sheets, had shaped pricing. Markets were no longer asking who was strong. They were asking who would be supported. Inside banks, unease replaced confidence. Treasury desks modeled scenarios that had once felt theoretical. What if support did not arrive? What if silence meant refusal rather than reassurance? The ambiguity that had once stabilized behavior now amplified uncertainty. Regulators faced their most difficult choice. Acting would confirm expectations they wanted to dissolve. Not acting would allow markets to test limits aggressively. The shadow had to be addressed without becoming substance. That required precision. Signals began to shift quietly. Official language hardened. Statements emphasized resolution frameworks rather than continuity. Stress exercises were publicized. Authorities reminded markets, subtly but firmly, that losses would fall where risk was taken. The message was not dramatic. It was deliberate. Markets reacted with discomfort. Pricing adjusted. Funding became more discriminating. The calm that had rested on assumption began to erode, replaced by assessment. This was the cost of clarity. Stability gave way to differentiation. Inside institutions, behavior changed quickly. Liquidity buffers grew. Risk appetite tightened. Plans were revised to account for uncertainty that had long been ignored. The system did not break. It recalibrated. Spain's shadow guarantees were not revoked. They were confronted by forcing markets to question belief. Authorities restored discipline that had been dulled by silence. The adjustment was uneven and uncomfortable, but it was necessary, because expectations that are never tested eventually become liabilities. And as Spain's system absorbed the shift, one truth became clear. Stability built on assumption cannot last indefinitely. At some point, the shadow must either become a rule or disappear. The resolution came not through a dramatic declaration, but through consistency. Authorities held their line. No special support was announced. Resolution tools were emphasized. Institutions were allowed to face differentiated outcomes. The shadow was neither confirmed nor fulfilled. It was allowed to fade. Markets adjusted slowly. Risk premiums reappeared. Funding costs aligned more closely with fundamentals. Confidence returned, but in a different form. It was no longer assumed. It was assessed. Stability became conditional on structure rather than belief. Banks adapted accordingly. Balance sheets were strengthened where vulnerability had been masked. Liquidity planning became more conservative. Strategy shifted away from reliance on proximity and toward resilience. The system absorbed the transition without collapse, but not without cost. Spain's experience reshaped thinking across Europe. Implicit support can calm markets temporarily, but it corrodes discipline if left unchallenged. Clarity, even when uncomfortable, is ultimately stabilizing. Expectations must match policy, or they will eventually break against reality. The shadow guarantees had done their job during recovery. They had allowed trust to return when it was needed most. But their time had passed. Allowing them to linger would have risked a sharper reckoning later. By letting the shadow dissolve gradually, Spain avoided a confrontation that could have been far more disruptive. The system matured, trading assumption for assessment. The lesson was quiet but powerful. Stability cannot rely on promises never made. It must rest on rules that can be enforced, limits that are known, and risks that are priced honestly. So what do you think? Are we repeating the same mistake again? Spain